dualities in our very unique ways of seeing as design students, young practitioners, and as a design institution. You can access the Lines of Sight exhibition through linesofsight.nid.edu. As remote learners and teachers, we have spent most of this past year as very near-sighted beings, living in teleworlds. The act of seeing becomes more significant than ever. It has to be thought of anew to develop active seeing, active listening, thoughtful reflection, and careful action. As designers, we are learning to see again by slowing down our processes, taking time to reflect, and showing care in our efforts. Exhibiting over 200 classroom and graduation projects virtually, and as a pop-up exhibition on the NID Ahmedabad campus, Lines of Sight probes into themes of inclusivity, speculation, technology, sustainability, narratives and archives, contextual to the UN SDGs, education, health and well-being, and culture studies. The curatorial theme for Lines of Sight follows 5 sights. Foresight, the act of envisioning the paths to reaching an outcome or solving a problem. Insight, the potential for design as an epistemic process through research and practice. Hindsight, the sight for reflecting on histories, archives, craft, and considering holistic ideas of narratives. Oversight, investigating what was missed out on, both systemically and in our practice. Farsight, speculating on futures that are ecologically sustainable, inclusive of all identities, and largely egalitarian. And now we welcome our panelists for today, the guest speaker, celebrated NID alumnus, Anab Jain, co-founder and creative director at Superflux, our faculty interlocutor, Sahil Thappa, who is also a product design faculty member at NID Ahmedabad, student presenters, Amogh Jadhav, Sidhhant Malviya, Aditya Laad, and Soukarni Barai. I also welcome my fellow Lines of Sight curators, Tanishka Kachru, Faculty Exhibition Design, NID Ahmedabad, Sucharita Beniwal, Faculty Textile Design, NID Ahmedabad, Abhirami, Amogh, Amrita, and Ritika. Now, here's the proposed format of events planned for today. First, following this introduction that I'm giving, we'll have our guest speaker, Anab Jain, speak about their experience and observations from the speculative and critical design industry. They will also share with us their interpretation of foresight in design practice. Following that, we will have brief presentations by the student speakers whose works fall under a very common umbrella theme and deal with speculation, a lot of sustainable development goals, technology, and our perceptions of our near and far futures. We will then have a 20-minute long roundtable format of discussion with all the panelists present here today. And to everyone watching live, please note down your questions and remarks in the chat and comment sections, because our volunteers will note them down to be shared during our 10-minute long Q&A session at the end. The theme for today's session is foresight. Foresight, as we know, is the ability to correctly judge what will happen in the immediate future and plan your actions based on this knowledge. The main inquiry that is guiding this curatorial track is, how do we envision the outcome of our processes, the futures it creates, the problems it solves, the structures it builds and become part of, and overall the impact that it has on the people, environment, and the society as a whole that it is situated in. Now, about our guest speaker today, Anab Jain, co-founder and director of Superflux, is a designer, futurist, filmmaker, and educator. Over the last 15 years, Anab has gained international recognition for her work and commentary on design, innovation, emerging technologies, and complex futures. She is the recipient of the Award of Excellence, ICSID, UNESCO Digital Arts Award, and Grand Prix Geneva Human Rights Festival, as well as awards from Apple and the UK government's Innovation Department. Anab, the floor is now yours.
Thanks, Geetika. Thanks so much to you, everyone at Lines Sight, and for inviting me to this Points of View conference. I'm delighted to be back here at my alma mater, even if it's virtually. I had a very, very memorable experience in time at NID and truly value the education I got there. Today, I'll just share a little bit about my ideas around foresight and some of my practice. Are you able to see my screen, everyone? Is that, yeah? I just wanted to kind of say that I have kind of, with my co-founder, John Arden, have led Superflux for about 12 years now, was working at Nokia, at Microsoft Research, and such other organizations after graduating from the Royal College of Art. I also, for the last 5 years, have been leading a program called Design Investigations. It's a 5-year program similar to what NID used to be, around speculative design, critical design, but also kind of a mix of experience design and social design. So I'd perhaps start by talking about what the definition of foresight is generally, which is the ability to predict what will happen or needed in the future. And here it's a kind of like generalized definition, but I really want to draw attention to the word predict, because I want to very quickly say that I'm not in the business of predicting. So even though our practice is based around foresight and futures, we do not predict the future. We do not believe in predicting the future, because the future does not beam data back to us and cannot be predicted as such. So I think I want to kind of draw a line to that kind of idea. Sorry. Instead, I want to talk about the other aspects of foresight that we find truly fascinating and embed in our work. So it is possible, while it's not possible to predict the future, it is possible to understand complex patterns. It is possible to speculate, imagine, and simulate different possibilities. And it is possible to learn to therefore stay open to uncertainty and thrive in it. And I think these are the key things that hold our practice together. The idea is that whilst we don't know that this will be the future and this is how things will happen, there could be many possibilities. And the more we work with complexities and systems, we are able to see the connections between these different possibilities. And if we are able to speculate and make these possibilities more visceral, more tangible, then we could start to understand potential opportunities, but also unintended consequences of where we are headed. So it is more of a way to plan and explore alternatives to the way we know what exists today. And that's where I'd like to situate it. And the reason I would like to say that we cannot predict the future is, despite so much work done in the foresight world, COVID was not predicted to the extent to which it happened. So you could argue that COVID was a healthcare issue, but we've seen very quickly that it did not stay in its lane of healthcare. It was going everywhere. It affected our relationships, it affected our mental health, it affected food insecurity, it affected geopolitical relationships, it affected power relationships, it's affected our economies. These are not things that could have been easy to predict. So one kind of reminder in our work, and to something that we do with our clients and commissioners quite a lot, is to say that just because we cannot imagine a future does not mean it cannot happen. The other thing is something that maybe some of you are more familiar with, something that Joseph Voros has often talked about in a really clear way, about the idea of the future cone, where often in organizations there is this kind of linear trajectory of we are here now, and therefore our future will be sort of similar. It's the idea of exponential growth. What's happening now will continue to happen exponentially in the future. But what we try to often say is that it's important that many other nested possibilities, from the plausible to the impossible and even the preposterous, need to be considered, because it is in these spaces that other possible futures, where there's potential for new business models, new revenue streams, fresh insights, and doing things that have never been done before. And we also know that there's even enough evidence amongst companies who continue down the linear route to face quite disastrous consequences. This is some insights pulled from a book called Radical Uncertainty, Decision Making and John Kane. who are economists. They're hardcore economists. They were in the business of prediction. They are in the business of economic modeling. And now they've come to acknowledge that radical uncertainty is what is driving our current worlds, that climate, economic, and social systems are not linear, and we have to be able to adjust to multiple variables and actions. They go on to argue that our context, our failure to understand this context, this kind of idea of radical uncertainty, and in particular, our attempts to model our way through using data and statistics are at the root of poor decision-making and much of our current woe. So to that, I'd argue that, I couldn't agree more in terms of, in all our practice, what we've noticed is that a lot of people talk about being open to uncertainty, but it's often seen as a cool thing to say or a meme or something, but it's neither. It's quite a rigorous and exhausting practice to hold multiple possibilities, multiple worldviews at the same time, to not get swayed by popular opinion, and find the connections between these possibilities and not retreat from the ache. And here I want to bring this classic debate going on in the world right now, right? Whether if you believe in vaccination, then you're everybody must get vaccinated. And if you have any doubt about what this will do to my health, a vaccine that hasn't gone through phase 3 of testing, then you're an anti-vaxxer. And is there a space for debate and understanding of what these other points of view are trying to tell us without falling into very rigid ways of thinking? Because then you're closing down possibilities. So in our work, in our practice, we have worked alongside futurists, strategic foresight practitioners, scenario modelers, economic modelers, and we find that they use a certain kind of toolkit, which is relying on very data-centric, rational models of forecasting and statistics and so on. And what we want to bring in is the idea that perhaps these things have not worked. They have failed because they did not help predict or bring to light so many of the complex challenges we face today. So maybe there is room for imagination, for speculation, for world building, for narrative, for experiences that perhaps bring us more to the core of what's going on today. They talk to our emotional and biological wiring, so to speak. And this is to that, we sort of have this diagram that I made many years ago, but seems to work, where we often say that, there is consensus reality in the middle. There are the very, very strong established narratives, that are holding this consensus reality in place. But then moving out from there is those weak signals on the edges, what you might call the strange now, and then future possibilities. And our work is often to kind of move across these spaces, not think of the future as a linear thing, but more as a cyclical idea. In order to uncloak the strange now and in order to explore future possibilities. This is just a glimpse of some of our projects. We are very much interested in creating stories and visceral experiences that simulate different possible futures in the present. The future cannot be seen, but it can be imagined. And if those imaginations can be seen, touched, smelled, heard, and experienced, then that opens up doors of possibility, a possibility of choices that can be very powerful and empowering. So our work tends to involve objects, artifacts, systems, installations, across various corporate, commercial organizations, cultural sector organizations, not-for-profits and foundations, alongside our own self-initiated projects. So quite often what you might see on our website are projects that we've initiated ourselves. Google with Omidyar Network will be released soon, but Suncorp or some of these other organizations may never be made public, but are informing internally or inspiring internally organizations to try alternate methods. For instance, we work with Google AI to explore how personal artificial intelligence can help create sustainable circular economies. We had DeepMind imagine alternative narratives around AI. We're currently partnering with IKEA to bring their climate change commitments to COP26 and so on. These are projects that I cannot really share, but just to give you a sense of the kind of expanse of work in terms of such a practice that is not necessarily built in traditional ideas of design has immense potential and even a need in the times we live today. I suppose we say that we are interested in translating future uncertainty into present day choices. We often say we surface big insights into interrelated forces that shape our world and bring them to life by enabling experiential engagement with the future. We start by what you might call sense-making, a wide-ranging process of analyzing data, watching trends, scanning emerging technologies, looking for anthropological and ethnographic insights, exposing ourselves to new ideas, following intuitive hunches, getting a sense of their emotional content and reflecting on our own emotional experiences and responses. All of this to find what's known as weak signals. So these are bits of the future that arrive early into the buzzing noise of the now. And then we find threads of possibility in this complex chaos that draw out and connect ideas, possibilities together. I'll just kind of, what I'll do is I'll just kind of share about 3 quick projects to give you a sense of different scales as well. So this one was done a few years ago called the Future Energy Lab. It was a project with the government of the United Arab Emirates. They invited us, the Ministry of Energy invited us to help them shape their country's energy strategy all the way up to 2050. We got a lot of econometric models and data from them, but we were clear that when you are making policy changes, you're not just affecting numbers on a graph. Those numbers can mean something very real to people. So we started off by translating some of their econometric models into this large city model and visualized many possible features on it. As you can see, it was animated. They could start to see the different things of behavioral changes, even happiness index changing with this changing patterns of kind of renewable energy sort of spread within the government. And I was talking to these group of various heads of various energy companies, but also ministers from the cabinet about the strategies they might need to deploy to move from extreme use of indulgent fossil fuel-led energy to renewables. And then one of them was saying that, one of the ministers, I think, said that, you talked a lot about our need to move towards public transport. The thing is, we cannot do that in our country. We love our cars, but also, I can't even tell my own son to stop driving his car. So we were prepared for this reaction. I was actually in Ahmedabad that time and worked with the chemistry department at Gujarat University and created these samples of what toxic polluted air in 2036 would feel like to inhale based on the projected data. And so we took this kind of bottled air and invited the ministers to have a little, breathe a little bit of the air. And that was slightly dangerous. Actually, it was quite toxic. But you do have to take some risks in your life, don't you? So yeah, it was important that they get a sense viscerally of the deeply toxic, polluted air that their children and grandchildren will breathe if they do not act today. And I have to admit that it's not just that. Alongside with the data that was presented to them, plus this experience was very, very deeply impactful. Within a few days, they announced a new economic strategy. Their goal was to balance economic needs with environmental goals. And, 756 billion dirhams were apparently allocated to move towards renewable energies. So this is to say that such projects, of which this is a good example, is that one of the most powerful means of affecting change is when people can directly, tangibly, and emotionally experience the future consequences of their actions today. They need not be the futures. They could be just possibilities. It could be an experience from one possible future, but it can be much more moving than showing, for instance, a PowerPoint. Another quick project, well, it was not quick, actually, it's a project that has been going on for a long time, but perhaps one of our most ambitious ones is around called mitigation of shock, where we were looking at global land and ocean temperature index like this one from NASA, which is a simple linear graph, but behind it hides immense amount of challenges we're likely to face moving forward. This is only projections still where we have been, and this red lines continue to go upwards. So, things like per capita food consumption will go from 32 kilos to 52 kilos, increased volatility in price and production, not to mention, vast amounts of weather-related catastrophic events. So when we were looking at such kind of information on climate, because it was something that we've been thinking about for a long time, we then were also plotting, actually, this is not very clear to read, I realize, but if you also plotted a timeline to start mapping everything after NASA's graph moving forward, speculate. So this is entirely speculative, but really the question that we were asking was that what do these kind of data sets mean to people in their lived lives? How do people find themselves in the graph? What does it mean? And so we wanted to bring that kind of question to life around climate and make it much more tangible. So we explored one possible future where the Western world moves from abundance to scarcity. We imagine living in a future city with repeated flooding, periods with almost no food in supermarkets, economic instabilities, broken supply chains. The question was, what can we do to not just survive, but prosper in such a world? What food can we eat? Of course, we were inspired by Jugaad. John was busy building food computers from found materials using this technique of fog ponics. So you're just using nutrient fog, no water or soil to grow things quickly. We build them from salvaged, abandoned, and repurposed materials, turning today's waste into tomorrow's dinner. And let me give you a quick glimpse of the documentation of the final outcome. The final project was an installation that transported people into a London flat, perhaps around 2050 or so, when my son would be around my age today. At first glance, a seemingly comfortable living space designed for a world of automated living, global trade, and material abundance. But on closer inspection, a realization that the apartment has been adapted to a future it was never meant to inhabit. Discarded newspapers and a radio show reflect the tensions of this new world. A smart panel constantly asking the fridge to refill milk, but where is the milk in this world? Amongst the detritus of now obsolete smart devices and designer goods lives a new reality formed by the impact of climate change. Recipes and cookbooks in the kitchen reflect the changes in food production, storage, and consumption. Experimental food production now occupies space once given to relaxation, transforming this apartment into a space for growing and producing food. Resourcefully hacked together consumer items like IKEA shelves, decorative fog makers, computer fans, programmable microcomputers, LED lamps, fog oozing out of these contraptions, blinding purple light, droning sounds, water pipes, mycelium growing, snares, foxen, chilies, all bearing fruit in these blasted ruins of capitalism. Looking beyond there lies a city familiar yet alien. The exhibition was on for about 6 months, and over 100,000 people visited it. The point of view of foresight is that this was not a prediction, but it's not a computer render either. The intention of such a speculative approach with hands-on experimentation is that it offers us the opportunity to very directly step into a different future to confront our fears but can also show concrete ways in which we can mitigate the shock of climate change. It's a space that nurtures hope and desire for transformative action with awareness and responsibility. And that's because, it's very, very important that people see themselves as actors in this future. They're situated in it. And to do that, the abstract future must be made proximate and tangible. Another version of this was later shown, a new updated one at Art Science Museum in Singapore. In this instance, we decided not to work with forkponics, but with natural systems of companion species and health based on principles inspired from permaculture. We imagine that over a period of time, this apartment becomes a real microcosm of human and non-human species living together. One thing to say is also that we meticulously handcrafted tools for gathering, consuming, and snaring food. These are spears made from whittled bamboo, plastic waste, and discarded Arduino circuit boards to show that the detritus of the Anthropocene found a new ritualistic purpose in this future. And looking out, you can see a different, wet, humid Singapore. While extreme weather conditions, economic uncertainty, and broken global supply chains have changed the world as we know it today, it's the sheer ingenuity of inhabitants, the tools, artifacts, plants, and new ways of living that start to tell hopeful stories of adaptation. And this kind of an immersive experience, just to remind ourselves and those we work with, is that it's better to be surprised, as my friends Jake Dunnigan and Stuart Candy talk, to be surprised by simulation than be blindsided by reality. And finally, very briefly, I'm going to run through this because I know I'm almost out of time, is this installation, which is in the last week at the Mark Museum of Applied Arts in Vienna, called Invocation for Hope. And this is much more of an artistic project. Here we are trying now to move from speculative realism and the ideas of speculative realism towards more sort of more than human mythopoetic narratives. We were looking at the wildfires that were happening in 2019, 2020 across the world. There was one that happened in Neukirchen region, this particular forest an hour from Vienna. And so we collaborated with them to salvage and transport 400 burned trees because actually wildfires spread because of monocultures in such forests. And most of our forests today are actually monocultures for maximizing yield. Single species forests burn faster. So as a result of the human attempt to exert control over nature, the fire-blackened forest served as a synecdoche for anthropogenic climate change as a whole. So you see in the space, the visitors walk and meander past this kind of grid of monoculture bird forests. I'll kind of run through the video here a little bit. To start approaching the center of the installation, which is more focusing on resurgence. So it's really intended to be a visitor journey from what feels like an apocalyptic space to a resurgent space. Upon entering the space, you're greeted by birdsong, and many multiple living species of different trees and mosses and nitrogen fixers to invite people to consider a more multi-species cohabitation. Yeah, we did some special effects with foggers, couldn't resist. And at the heart of it is a pond. And in the pond, the idea is to have a moment of reflection and introspection. But when you look in the pond, rather than, oh, sorry, I go back. Oops. Where will I go back? Yeah. You see reflections of different animals and species looking back at you rather than your own reflections. So in some ways, reminding ourselves that we are one amongst many. We share this planet with multiple species with whom we are deeply interconnected and with whom we are deeply interdependent. And therefore, to acknowledge that rather than exert control over nature becomes important as we move forward in these challenging times. And that is also something we did for a project currently being shown at the Architectural Biennale in Venice, where it's a multi-species banquet, where alongside humans, a raven and a beaver and a pigeon, and especially pests and vermin like rats and pigeons and snakes are also invited to share a seat at the table. And what does it mean to give other species the same important significance as we give to other humans? And how might that change our relationships with consumption patterns, with how we think of our planetary responsibilities? It has a
changing
chant,
in unison with one another,
prayer, and a poem that we wrote.
In unison with the changing climate and drifting continent. The dance of life, ebbing and flowing across time.
We'll be sharing these films online soon. And to conclude that sort of thinking has been guided in recent times by this kind of field guide to what I call a more than human politics, where we move from a more human-centered approach towards a more than human-centered perspective in order to start to influence our relationships, our narratives, our designs, what we make and put out in the world. How do we move from the idea, the meta narrative of endless growth towards something around nurturing and caring and interdependence, and so on. And I think this is something I want to leave you with, something to think about, and something to consider is also what Ursula Le Guin talks about, that you all have vast amounts of, I'm sure, your imagination, the ability and willingness to imagine alternatives to reality as we know it, which is always the first step towards making different and better realities possible. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anab. As an exhibition design student, I'm a big fan of your work personally. And what you shared with us today, it's been a very incredibly generous peek into your practice and thought process. Thank you for all of that. Now, as we design for current and future realities, the anxieties and aspirations of the present often reflect very vividly in the works that are being featured in this track. They either respond to the very pressing issues posed by the pandemic or some long-term systemic issues that plague human development and possibly got us where we are today. They use speculation and altruistic thinking to ask relevant questions and solve such problems. And here we are sharing the student projects that have been featured in the LOS exhibition under the track of Foresight and Foresight. The project Internet's Energy by Amogh Jadhav explores concepts of reusable e-waste to comment on current practices of manufacturing electronic devices.
With the rise of internet devices and heavy energy consumption, it's apparent that sustainable forms of future internet usage need to be devised. This project looked at establishing a new framework for the internet through the Data Energy Unit, or DEU. Artifacts and website interactions were developed to show the potential of this framework in a context deliberately extrapolated to a scenario set in 2050 to highlight plausible adversaries faced by humankind if sustainable measures are not adopted soon. The artifacts explored concepts of reusable e-waste to comment on current practices of manufacturing electronic devices. For me, working to build the artifacts from home provided a unique perspective. I visited the Zuna Bazaar in Pune to gather components like old radios or dictaphones. I saw how old objects are valued in this market and how the local economy works for people and vendors doing business selling scrap. It made me think about the differing perspectives of people on the same things and how value of objects change. Designing a website to show plausible interactions through DEU was also insightful. It showed that indeed it is possible to build and implement many of the things explored in this project, but much is shaped by external push factors. I wasn't sure if anyone would understand the project in a glance, since there are so many components to it, and I had to accept the fact that it is okay. Everyone has a different points of view, and I simply want this project to serve as a conversational starter, a glimpse into how we can reimagine today's reality and the fact that a singular future does not exist. Rather, we as humans are constantly co-creating our futures from our own unique perspectives. So far, this project has been explored through an interaction design perspective. Narratives and stories are designed to be communicated through interactions with the artifacts on the website. Going ahead, I want to explore the implications on a systems level and see how these interactions can be made available to a larger audience.
The project Mycelium Matters by Sidhhant Malviya is an inquiry into new ways of designing and creating products technologically and sociologically.
Hi, I'm Sidhhant. For the past year and a half, all through the COVID lockdown, I had been experimenting with biomaterials, mycelium, bacterial cellulose, and a little bit with starch-based bioplastics. I started my graduation project with one thing in mind, to find a way to work with more advanced biomaterials and to find ways to create objects biologically rather than industrially. This, I believe, should help us move away from the ecologically disastrous ways of industrial production that we have right now. The question is, can we ever have a way of producing things that does not eventually kill us? It is unquestionable that plastics have enabled us to advance our civilization. Plastics, and oil for that matter, are materials that are extremely useful with great properties. These are materials that can outlast us many, many times because of their great durability. But as long as these durable materials stay in the environment, they cause ecological havoc. So now it is really important that we have materials that perhaps do not outlive us, sustainable materials that are not against life as plastics are but made of life, which grow and die as we do. Biomaterials are such materials. They are made by living organisms through living processes and are inherently sustainable. These materials, they can go back to the soil to enrich it, and they achieve a positive circularity, a cradle-to-cradle means of production. One such material is mycelium. It is the name given to the vegetative part of the fungus, the network of interconnected fungal cells that grow like roots and bind together the food they grow on. Mushrooming fungi can be used to make composites. Composites are made of the fungus and agricultural waste. These composites are useful for a wide range of applications, such as packaging, lightweight products, insulation and acoustic panels, and even as load-bearing structures for architectural applications. On the other hand, pure mycelium can be used to make leather alternatives, foams, and even be used as artificial meat. Similarly, bacterial cellulose is a material obtained by the culture of certain bacteria in sugar solutions to obtain this material that mimics leather and is surprisingly strong. For my project, I started with basic experiments in which I tried to make a variety of biocomposites using different kinds of agricultural waste, such as wheat husk, rice husk, gram plant residue, and corn waste. I also used some new substrates such as tea leaves and tapioca. I used two different fungal varieties, and with them I created a lot of different sorts of composites. By the end of my project, I had created several reliable processes to create composites, bacterial cellulose leather, and discovered some new methods to create mycelium-based products. I'd like to talk a little about my project here with Aditya. I'm here for a residency to produce an exhibition that I've named now A Performance of the Biofuture. In this, first I'll teach a group of citizens to create simple biomaterials. Then we'll create a theatrical production where everything, including the props and dresses, etc., are made by the citizens using these biomaterials. After, we'll perform through this theater an episode from a hopeful biologic future. Through this project, we intend to create awareness for the biomaterials and for a bio-derived method of production. We intend to open dialogue about the current methods of industrial design and production and how they differ from this other kind of future that we could possibly have. We want to engage people directly into a discursive way of design, and we want to create opportunities for further interest in experimentation.
The project Dhi by Aditya, Laad and Soukarni Barai creates a virtual reality-oriented intervention for mental well-being during the pandemic.
The journey of Dhi for our team began over a design brief that we connected with. It was instant for both of us on a very personal level. The terrifying reality of an absent social life in the pandemic and its invisible claws digging deep scars into our human mental well-being. In a long conversation over a WhatsApp phone call, I recall Aditya and I mentioning how much we aspired to spend more time socially back on campus with our friends, how the pandemic is a brutal blow to our mental development, and how it has invisible after effects that may last for a few decades in many history books. A personal cry for help from our end translated into this inquiry. Due to the inability of physical infrastructure, the world turned to a rapidly developing technology spectrum. Non-contact, haptic trends in technology led us to discover the spectrum of immersive virtual reality as a safe haven for people. We hit upon our realm of escape that could nurture, heal, and support the larger population. By using simple equipment like a VR headset, we developed a full-fledged game environment where human beings could travel beyond borders, engage without fear, and reconnect with themselves and others as per their own choice once again. The game was also grounded in many Indian Ayurvedic concepts of the chakras. This was done to induce a practice of mindfulness and mental control within the participants who would engage in our mental well-being environment, a way of training the mind apart from healing it. The reason we built a gamified environment was because it made mental well-being feel more accessible and less of a taboo within the Indian cultural context. We also saw the junction of gamification, technology, and mental health as a vast untapped lagoon of potential. With technology advancing towards better mental health, we foresaw the new arena as a fitting path to embark upon with not just current relevance, but future support for community resilience to help us all heal together.
The floor is now open for a roundtable discussion between today's speakers. We welcome Anab Jain, our guest speaker, and Sahil Thappa as faculty interlocutor for this discussion to share their thoughts, observations, and questions along with all the student presenters.
Thank you, Anab, for the in-depth presentation and also sharing your work. And personally, I've been following your work for almost a decade now as a student and then also as a teacher at product design. And in the past, we've taken references of the work you guys do at Superflux as benchmarks. So it's nice to have you with us. So there are certain questions or certain triggers which came to my mind when I was asked to be here. So in one of the talks by Paulo Cardini, there was an interesting comment he made that someone sitting in San Francisco right now is creating a future. And that brings me to the question that, first of all, who decides where that future falls in the cone diagram you showed? And is that the future the rest of the world really needs or wants? And as a designer, who are we actually to be taking a stance? Are we futurists? Are we pioneers? Are we facilitators? Or what exactly a designer do in this scenario? because this is a very complex and wicked issue because the world is changing at a rapid pace, and we have climate change. The number of billionaires are increasing day by day, and the wealth gap is increasing, and mega corporations are of the net worth, which can easily supersede the net worth of certain countries combined. So how do we as designers locate ourselves in a complex world like this? And especially when it comes to speculative design or critical design, what role do we play?
Yeah. Wow, big questions. I will try and answer little bits of them because I don't think I really fully, to be honest, have an answer as such. So I would say critical design has two components: is the criticality or the lens of criticality through which you look at a brief or an idea or a project, but it's also to critically reflect on your own work. So quite often it's meant to be a self-reflexive process. I kind of want to park critical design out of this conversation because it's not really something that is necessarily an outward facing toolkit, so to speak. With speculative design, or what you call futures design or design futurescaping or what have you, is again a whole bunch of different things. And I think so I think one of the premises of our practice is going against the grain of what, if I had studied design in NID, I studied filmmaking, so I didn't have to face that, was the idea of problem solving. That you as a designer are in the service of the industry and it is your role to solve problems. And that is something that was deeply ingrained in the system of NID, and it totally makes sense for a certain kind of projects. But design's ability to solve problems can also open up bigger problems. When you start creating dams where they're not necessary, then you break the flow of rivers and you cause massive upset to ecosystems. The problem you've solved at one level becomes a bigger problem at another level. So I think that awareness is deeply important. So then when you start thinking of your role as not necessarily there for an instant fix or to solve one specific problem, but to address complex challenges, then what you're looking to do is to find responses, to raise questions, to find the right kind of questions to ask, first of all, then to find the right responses, which may be, in some cases, interventions, in some cases a speculation, in some cases a documentation or a strategy, in some. So I'm trying to acknowledge the fact that 21st century designers are not in the service of industry as such, because the industry that we knew in the 20th century model of design is the reason we are in the climate crisis that we are today. So let's all kind of acknowledge that. And if we were to acknowledge that, then we start to understand design's shifting role in this. And then in these muddy waters that we then land ourselves, because the narrative is no longer that clear cut, we need to find our own sort of interests, collaborations, networks, and then start to develop, your position within that. So you may not necessarily go and have a job ready for you because the jobs that are there may not fit your interest, but that's then your role as designers to start creating your own jobs. Not easy at all. I don't even say for once it's easy, but that's where interesting things will start happening.
Thank you. You mentioned collaborating with people. So you also mentioned the era of design, which was majorly aimed at industrial production. So it was majorly coming from the perspective of designing for people. And lately there has been a shift, which is focusing on designing with people as collaborators, as co-creators. So when it comes to that, and because my personal work relies a lot on open source, so how do we make speculations and futures more open source and more participatory in nature? Like, Anthony used to use a word called social dreaming. So how do we make this entire process of social dreaming more participatory and more co-created, in which people take part in creating their futures rather than being passive observers or people on whom things get forced on. So how can speculation and future building become more people centric and more designing with people rather than for people?
Yeah. I've done both. So I've been in situations where we've done, one of my earliest projects was around co-creation. I think it's participatory design and co-creation sounds nice. Frankly speaking, most of the time people don't have time to engage in these kind of, people are not even engaging in government consultations about should there be a closure of the school down the road or not, because they don't have time. And on top of that, you are asking and demanding of them their time for things that they know may or may not materialize. I think we have to be quite careful about the asks we make of our communities and of our people. But I very, very much believe in the idea of nurturing public imagination and nurturing collective public imagination. And for that reason, whatever work we do is out in the open. We are not, the process, the story behind it, what the outcomes are often in the public domain, is to nurture public imagination. So it is to say that if you are entering a forest and if you are finding yourself in an apartment that at one level feels familiar, but at one level is unfamiliar, nowhere is the word climate change mentioned anywhere in the apartment. Nowhere are people being told how they need to put the evidences they see in that apartment together or connect the dots. You are giving them a container for them to then start putting themselves in that experience fully and totally. And what happens because of that is that what we have found is we've got people got really angry. It's like, how can you say that this will be the future? How could you imagine it so dystopic? How, then after the wildfires in Australia, because it was in Singapore, so I was like, how could you see what's happening in the world? You think people will still be able to live in cozy homes? So our own memories of our futures are very short term, if I can say something like that. It's really very much dependent on what happens today. And this is something because it's known as temporal myopia. So when people start thinking about the future, they start thinking as if it's going to happen to someone else. They are not able to put themselves in the future far away. And there's a lot of neurological science and cognitive science around this. So what we are doing in some way is triggering their episodic memory. So when you trigger people's episodic memory, they feel it's something that has already happened to them. And that becomes a process. So none of this is straightforward. I don't think it's one or the other. I don't think it's saying top down or bottom up, but I think you have to be really careful about the processes we shape for the kind of work we want to do. And there's no one answer fits all.
And you also mentioned right now that people at times are not willing to engage in matters related to public. So also one of the things lately, which I personally have been observing, is politics is something which is really critical when it comes to taking decisions which affects masses. So when it comes to speculation or creating future scenarios, how critical does a designer need to be taking in view politics? Because that's sometimes, a lot of time we try to take a very neutral stance or say that politics is something which doesn't bother me. So, but when you're thinking about future, politics is something which majorly defines where a country or wherever we are headed. So how critical or how do you take care of that in your own projects?
It's interesting. I've had conversations about this with people who call themselves futurists, and some of them would say, we lay it out as is. It is not my job to lean your decision towards one thing. So the way they will do is they lay it out as it is, that there is misinformation, there are culture wars, there is currently identity politics around this. This is the nature of the identity politics. This is the nature of racism, whatever you have it, the current kind of narratives. Our work doesn't separate our politics that much from it, because we are telling stories from, and I think there was also a question that was an answer to that effect somewhere here, but I find it hard to be able to say that I have a neutral point of view, because what does that even mean? And when we were studying filmmaking, it was like, when you put your camera on your tripod and point at something, you have chosen to at that time frame that and leave some things out. And so that is your subjective gaze on the world. So to that extent of your frame, you kind of are you are biased, and you can be very open about your biases and you can acknowledge them, but you are biased.
So now we'll come back to questions again. Right now, I would like to ask you about your feedback, or how did you see these projects, the 3 projects we shared with you, like Amogh's, Sidhhant's, then Soukarni and Aditya's. Tell us a bit about that.
No, I thought all 3 projects were brilliant. I thought, especially what I found really interesting, like for Amogh's project, about the energy and the idea of, ownership, really powerful, and same with the other 2 projects. I'm very curious to see where the Mycelium project, because you've laid out a very, very clear plan of participation, and then I'm curious to see how that shapes up. I suppose it'd be nice to hear from all 4 of you, just having done the project, if you had a moment to reflect on what you took away from it or what you learned, I'd be curious to know. Amogh, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So before I did this project, I had absolutely no clue what speculative design was all about. Like when I used to see all these projects and these grad shows and see all these weird artifacts, I was like, is this design? I thought we were supposed to design for industry, create washing machines and things like that. And then after, like, this project was that journey of understanding that what you said, right? It's not just designing for the industry anymore. We're doing much more. So getting that understanding was something that this project really lent me. And even the idea that, so I was always in this flux state of, will people understand it? There was this moment where I was just sticking together like trash components together, creating something that was like the very opposite of what I imagined product design in itself to be, like where we create these fancy renders and sketches and go to a mass manufactured process. How would people even look at this project was something I was very concerned about. But then I learned that, it's okay. It's a story that I want to communicate, and it's fine if people don't understand it. Rather, it's actually better if they create their own versions of the stories and not the one that I told them to, or that I imagined. And I think this goes back to like Sahil's question that he asked about co-creating with people. I think one way is just to keep it vague sometimes, because people start filling in the gaps. That's what I noticed my batchmates do when I'm discussing the projects. I didn't talk about like the culture, the sort of culture there would be, or where would people live in this world. People just started imagining those things, and that is co-creating in essence. So yeah, it was a very mind-opening sort of project for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the best thing you're doing is you're leaving, if you're in your bachelor's, with both skill sets. So you are a product designer in that sense, and you are able to find a job. And I wouldn't want you all to not have jobs or work. So like, if you have to design a product, you should be able to design it. But at the same time, to keep the criticality and questioning alive, I think will help you in the long run. That's brilliant. How about you, Sidhhant?
So for me, the project started with a more technical perspective, because I've always been extremely fascinated with how we can make things with biology, and what is the future of material, what is the future of making things, because I was starting to feel that we're kind of saturated right now with the kind of ways we make things, which is completely industrial, completely plastic based, and we know for a fact that we are like completely entrenched in this way of living. And perhaps like biology can offer us a way out, because we're always talking about sustainability as this thing that uh, anything that is which is renewable has to go back to nature, and the only thing that nature can accept back would have to be biological. And so for me, this was a way to think about how, okay, now maybe we can refine these materials, make more experiments with them, and make perhaps make the properties of this material good enough that maybe someday we can replace plastics. But then as I more progressed with the project, I started to have a more a political intent with it. Like I have to say that I'm overtly political with the kind of design that I want to do now. Is that I realized that it's not just about the technical aspects of the thing that we are making. It is also about how we make it, how it fits into the overall political economy, how people consume it. And maybe it's not such a good goal to have a material that replaces plastic. And maybe it's for us to look back at the ways we live and not rely on materials that have to be so durable, and we might have to rethink the way we live. And so from then I started to think that instead of focusing now right now on like making the material extremely durable, what if I try to engage people directly into this project and see with whatever kind of material we have right now, how can we build our lives around it? How can we imagine a future like this? And I'm really inspired by the project that you did with the House of the Future, because that is something exactly how I envision my project to take direction in. That people are able to imagine and envision a future where we have climate change, the consequences of that, where we have to have deal with all of the everything that will eventually happen, and we'll have to see perhaps with some hope that maybe if we don't have plastics, maybe if we don't make things industrially, how are we going to make things eventually? Because yeah, so and the project that I'm working on right now is just is like a small experimentation in which I will try to see if I can teach people how to make this thing. And again, like I really I know this very well. I have experienced this now myself, that people don't have time. And this is kind of symbolic, is that I'm trying to find a way to fight against the way things are right now. And the way things are right now don't permit people to have a time to have the time to look at the future. And so yeah, it's this tension there that I have to try to resolve, to find people and to make them come and be engaged in the design process, make things for themselves, and then also perhaps try to imagine a speculative future with those things. So yeah, that's what I'm working on right now. Sorry for all the rambling answers.
No, that's great. I'm really excited to see. I think people could have, if you're, especially if it is material led, it can feel very satisfying if people make something. We had a mushroom growing workshop, and it was just packed because people love to take these things and see these mushrooms growing. So if you can, if people feel a sense of achievement at the end of the day, then that could be your kind of hook to get insights from them. Yeah, great stuff. Yeah, and Soukarni and Aditya, a subject close to my heart and which we all experience. So would love to hear more as well.
Yeah, so I'll just go first, and Soukarni can add on top of that. So this project was quite a personal investigation as to like what are the kind of adverse effects isolation can have on people. And when we kind of did this project, this was like during the lockdown, when we were actually experiencing all those like mental traumas and all the mental health issues personally also. And like looking back, it's been almost 1 year since we did this project, and since we're out of it, like looking back at those things, we actually realized that like the importance of mental health and the need for an accessible solution for a lot of people. And especially like the way tech is progressing, I think having solutions which are affordable and also accessible to a lot of people, not just to cure mental health issues, but also to make them make people aware about them. That is something that we kind of realize is something that a lot of people should think about, and that's where our project and our kind of inquiry came from, as to how can we make something which is like, so VR headset, VR virtual reality is something that has been like in the space for quite some time, but combining virtual reality with a space such as mental health, which is anyway a very sensitive topic, and that is another learning that we kind of like realize, as to we couldn't actually get on board a therapist or a medical professional to give us a very clear insights, but we had a lot of discussions with them. But moving forward, that is something that we would really like to work upon, which is like having good and quite accurate medical insights as to what all can be developed for various personalities of people. So because one thing doesn't work for everybody, and we kind of realize that like there is one thing which is like intention as to how we make things and how people perceive it. So we also had to be like mindful about it. So it was like a very explorative in that sense. Like we kind of like, it was a hit and trial kind of a thing, but we kind of ended up making something which actually can open discussion in the space of mental health and immersive media. So that is how the project kind of like came about. Soukarni can add something on top of it.
Yeah. Anab, just want to say that it was great listening to the projects you have shared and everybody else's. To add to what Aditya was saying, I think fact about the two factors that you mentioned while speaking was criticality and reflection, which I think I was able to resonate with when we were doing our project, because it came from a person, as Aditya said, and also I see that the whole idea of having visceral experiences is something very essential at a time today, and especially when people are craving for these experiences and were away from it for a while. And our environment that we tried to conceptualize was with that intent, that we want people to be able to feel safe, and boundaries or walls do not limit us, and that we can reclaim the space that we need in many ways. Also, like there's a realization, I think, by the end, that a project like this in the context of the Indian community might be an interesting approach to begin dialogues around mental health, because it's still a very I would say wicked discussion, and there are many perceptions still that lie very tightly wound. It's not easy walk into it, and as Aditya said, I think medical professionals are the other collaborators with us, with whom I think if we have a good I would say engagement, or in some way if they guide us, it would be. Sorry, can you hear me better, Geetika? I'm so sorry. As I was saying, I think moving forward, as Aditya said, seconding what he was saying, we would really like to collaborate professionals to guide the vision that we have, because we see the potential in this junction. And interestingly, just one insight that tied in, which pushed us into the space, was the fact that while people were in isolation, game environments like spaces on Discord and and just the activity of gaming so popular, and we tried to connect that interest or trend with something like this. We did not think or understand if it would work out, but I think that's not been tried out, so it was a risk that way. And I think there's a lot of room for how and where this can go. So I think that is something very exciting for us. Yeah.
Great. Good luck with it. Yeah, no, it was very moving. Thank you.
I'd like to ask the student panelists here if they would want to talk about how their emotional space or their emotional states were during the course of this project, and how, like in the case of Aditya and Soukarni's project, we know very clearly, but Amogh and Sidhhant, even your philosophical conundrums that you must have faced while you were working on this project, because we all know that it was how it used to be, and it was truly a very different kind of environment that you were working in. So the ways in which what you felt and what you must have thought, and some conundrums, like I mentioned, that you must have faced, how did they, and if they did, how did they affect your project, your process, the outcomes that you chose to pursue, etc.?
So when I was working on this project, lockdown had still sort of opened up in India. It was before the second wave, and things were opening up. But still, we were working at home, so we didn't have studio access and all that. And my room had just completely transformed for the 8 weeks. There were like pieces of electronics and strap and wires and all of that hanging around. There's a tripod and a camera. But I don't think the project would have happened in the same way if I would have been in the institute. Because I got access to the Zuna Bazaar in Pune, though we have a similar thing in Ahmedabad. That was the only thing I had at the time. I would not have thought maybe of looking at it or actually creating those components from scratch. And as I mentioned before, like even the thought of not having a very predefined set process of sketching everything, and then knowing, okay, I'm going to use this material, rather how the people in my story themselves would create the artifacts is the way I chose to create the artifacts myself, by going to the bazaar, seeing what electronics would work, what would fit where, sort of getting that sense and then creating it. And that was a very different experience because it went against what was being taught so far in the traditional sense. In that way, lockdown did help because it gave me a chance to be away from certain spaces and just be free, not being judged constantly. I was only showing it to my guide, who was Sahil, and my faculties and friends. So yeah, that way it went well for me.
Thank you. What about you, Sidhhant?
So in the beginning, it was hard because the doing something like working with biomaterials, it kind of requires you to have some specialized environments and like really clean places and everything. So like for the first 3 months of the lockdown, I couldn't do anything. But eventually, since I was at home, I started to do my own setup, and it led to two things. One was that it was actually pretty cool to be to stay at home and to work and to stay with your parents after such a long time. And I think this was the first time as a fully grown adult that I was able to stay with my parents and know them as people and not as just caretakers. So that was kind of cool. And the other thing was that because I was doing it at my own at my home, and I had to like concoct a lot of ways to do it in a very jugaad way. But that made me realize that some of the things, some of the assumptions that we have about how things need to be done, especially when it comes to biology, is that they were challenged. And then it made me realize that this is something that actually a lot of people can do at their own homes without having to have access to a lot of specialized equipment. And this was also one of the catalysts for having the idea that maybe people can make their own things, people can make their own stuff biologically and don't have to rely on having to buy it from the market. So that was that. Other than that, like when it comes to the question of mental space, obviously it was kind of fucked because the 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 whole time of like being constantly alone in my home all the time, and having to grapple with all these weird feelings of isolation, and with having to think about the state of the world right now, and having to wonder about what will happen not just in the future but with my family and everything. So, and towards the end, like of the first or the second lockdowns, I was like super depressed because of how things looked, because when I was growing up, it was all about having, the progress of technology, the progress of society, and how we're going to solve every kind of problem we could possibly imagine. And now I found myself in in this like maybe the second or the third large economic crisis of my generation, and so many people dying, the state of my country right now, and everything. And it seems like, what kind of a future am I going to walk into? Things do not at all seem to be going better in any which way whatsoever. And so that led me to a lot of dark places, uh, but yeah, also led me to have a lot of different questions of how we think about our society, how we organize the world that we live in. So it was a roller coaster. Yeah.
Thank you, Sidhhant, for sharing that. So it's safe to say that we saw a lot of projection of personal pessimism in our worldviews as well. Anyway, now I invite Mr. Charita to to open the Q&A session and ask questions that have been emerging.
Hi. So this has been a really interesting session, and thank you, Anab and Sahil and Sidhhant, Amogh, Surnika and Aditya, for the dialogue that your work had speaking to each other. There are lots of questions in the chat as well as the Q&A for you, Anab. I'm going to combine some of those. Some of them have been answered. So like Swati Shivraj wanted to know your process and description for speculating. I think that has been answered in some ways.
Could I jump in this question from Siddhi, because I want to misunderstood that, I just want to respond to this question about not including people. And I definitely don't mean that we don't include people, but I need to come to this, and I think we need to come to this differently. We are not designing products or futures that we want people to inhabit. Therefore, we don't always need to ask people. So I think that is a very important thing. At no point am I making a policy or any kind of decision about what lives people should live in the future. So I think, and I don't think that is my role. So I think that's really important to make clear that if you will ask people, which we've done on a street, what would you like to see on your street? You'll find every household will have a different answer to what they would like to see on their street 10 years from now. Already, as a designer, if you were going to say that you're going to take everybody's answers and create the street of the future, you're inviting trouble, because there'll be a lot of discontent. There'll be a lot of people who will get the streets they did not ask for. So I think we need to really understand complexity here and acknowledge it. Asking people what they want and then giving them what they want is not a process of design that I would recommend in this situation. I think if you were designing a toothbrush and you were testing bristles of the toothbrush and you said, does this hurt? Is this soft? If 80% people thought this was the right bristle versus 20, you may go with that number. I think one thing is to really understand that what we are doing in conversation with many people, many experts and all of that is creating a possibility space for people to enter and experience for themselves, if they want that future or not. And if they feel that that is a future they absolutely are interested in or want or are scared by, does it then inspire or motivate them to go and do something about it? If they see and experience firsthand what it means to experience a future which is altered by climate change, does that inspire them and motivate them in a way? Does it inspire and motivate decision makers to make better decisions? Does it inspire and motivate powers to be from the corporate world to invest in renewables? So you have to see what the end goal is for the work you're doing. And thereby, if you're designing a space for people, then 100% you need to ask them and find a way to make sense of very, very diverse perspectives. So I think that's one thing to clarify. And then there are a few other questions in the Q&A that I could kind of try and say that, for instance, Hard markets, it is a hard one, hard markets, hard question. But I think that if you are working with organizations who are thinking very strongly and seriously about what strategies they apply for their future products or services, then you have room there for someone like you. So I think hard markets also need futures designers. About reductivity in a qualitative and subjective information. I think, again, I'll say that we don't try and make it reductive or too complex, but we try and find a point within complexity that we zoom and expand. So we're not trying to say everything. I don't think you can be very reductive or should be. And then I probably missed a lot of other questions. So maybe Sucharita, you could suggest if there were others. I'm just scanning up there.
No, Kadambari, you took Kadambari's one question on big data and how do you take it in and how do you put it together with your speculative. She had another question on how do you balance the over-sanitized, image-driven speculative futures versus and I would actually like to invite Siddhi and Urja. Siddhi first to ask the first question she had posted in the very beginning, after you answer Kadambari's question on the image-driven and over-sanitized. Speculation.
So that question, what was the whole question?
So the question was that how does culture fit into speculative futures? Because our speculative futures are often oversensitized, image-driven. So on the other hand, there's a romanticizing of other cultures. I think it's also about the fact that today you have Afro-speculative futures, you have global South futures that are coming in. And she's asking, how does your studio balance between these two? We still have very few coming from Asia, but
I mean, the seductive, saturated imagery is coming from the media. So everything that you're doing to counter that seductive, saturated, singular vision is great. Whether it's a Gulf futurism, where you're talking Sino-futurism, where you're talking about Afrofuturism, whether you're talking about, so you're bringing your geographical and political context to it, whether you're talking about alternative worldviews. In my instance, we're currently interested in more than human futures. So whatever the perspective is, what I would say is what you consider speculative design from the seductive point of view is really advertising, that large companies have co-opted these ideas. So you have Normcore and you have Gucci coming up with the idea of the new normal. These are all things that corporations co-opt and popularize, which is deeply problematic.
I agree, and I think so do most of the young designers who are moving towards this speculative futuring kind of space. Siddhi, you had a question in the beginning about policy making. Would you like to switch on your mic and ask it?
Yeah, Anab. So I wanted to ask that, where does SCD, speculative and critical design, fit in the context of developing countries where, people don't have access to clean water, especially when you as a speculative design practitioner, you understand that the need for speculative design in that context. But then how do you convince the change makers or the policy makers about why this kind of thinking is necessary?
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, even here where I live in the UK, we have food banks. I wouldn't say that inequality is perhaps harsher in India 100%, but there's a deep inequality here. There are really bad political decisions. A lot more people died of COVID than they should have. There is deep corruption. There's all sorts of problems here. To try and break into the world of policymaking, where decision makers of that kind have any interest in speculative design, is extremely difficult. It is difficult because everything is based around evidence gathering, and evidence is data is always what has been, not what will be. And if you're constantly going to make policy decisions on what has been, then you're going to be stuck in that kind of narrow view of what has been. So I would say that's always been our challenge. Occasionally with people like the UAE government, we cut through that because they work at speed and at scale in a way that's very different from most governments and most kind of policymakers. They are given 2 days to make decisions sometimes, and that is perhaps the only plus side of having a very top-down government system, where you're in a more of a democratic system where you are asking many people and constantly consulting, then you're stuck in a loop of bureaucracy, which is what happens here. So I think it's very important. That's why once I'd written a piece called Speculative Evidence Making, and the importance of having speculative evidences to guide policy. I haven't had much luck with people who really want to take that on.
We have one question from Murja, and I'll ask her to switch on her mic and ask. And I, as an academician, want to ask you one question on how do you think your education here and that at RCA influenced your balancing of, and I'm trying in some ways to also tie it back to what Kadambari initially tried to ask on how that culture part of and locatedness of being a nation in the first world comes through your work. But I think I'll let Murja ask her question, because there are many who want to know
that. My question is very simple, but it's quite hard for me actually. What can I do after graduation to kind of be able to do the work that you're currently doing?
Okay. Yeah. Gosh, I don't know. It's my real honest answer. I went straight to a job. I did a research associateship at RCA for a year after I graduated, and then I got a job at Microsoft Research and then a job at Nokia. So it wasn't like I graduated and started my practice the next day. So there's something to be said about doing jobs to know exactly what you don't want to do, because that was really useful. I knew I did not want to work in a 160,000 employee organization like Nokia. But that was very important learning. So I think that was one thing, and it kind of, I would say, I don't know, I suppose there's one thing to be said about being stubborn and acknowledging that you will live a fairly frugal life for a good few years. I think the one thing I have found with peers is that once you get into a very cushy job, then it gets harder and harder to get out of it, because then you have a family and a mortgage and debt and holidays to plan, and it gets increasingly more and more difficult. So it's that fine line where you have to choose, I'm going to set off on my own and fight it out, and may take a while, because you can always go back to a job if things don't work out for a bit. You're welcome.
So much, Anab. That was a very pressing question in the room. Sucharita, are we in a place to end the Q&A session?
Yeah, I think because of shortage of time, we're going to end the Q&A. But Anab, I'm going to still ask you on mail. If anyone else has questions, we'll take them up on mail and we can mail them to Anab.
Will do. No, this is super enjoyable and so well organized. Amazing. Thank you all.
All those who have persisting questions, please make a point to visit the Lines of Sight in Instagram and social media handles. You'll get to interact with the panel and more there. Anyway, while Foresight carries a tone of caution and calculation, the works of all the designers who are gathered here today beam with ambition. They critically analyze the past and the present while perceiving the immediate future with great hope and sensibility. And we take this opportunity to remind everyone about the upcoming sessions of Points of View. So stay tuned for the subsequent webinars addressing other curatorial tracks of Lines of Sight. where we continue to converse with stellar industry professionals, academicians, alumni, and young designers. We welcome you to tomorrow's session on oversight with design thought leader Dr. Dory Tunstall as guest speaker from 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. IST over the same Zoom webinar platform, and will be broadcast on YouTube as well. Anyway, with that, we conclude today's second session on foresight, thanking all the panelists for their valuable time and this very thought-provoking discourse that we just had. Many thanks to all those who have joined us today.
Thank you, Anab. Thank you, Sahil.
Thank you so much, Anab. Thank you.
Thank you. No, thanks for having
all
me.
student presenters.
Okay, bye.
Bye.